Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick, and it's a really exciting topic for me. Pretty much everybody who knows me knows that I'm a big-time templating nerd, and so, for this month, the patrons asked me to go through the templating of some custom cards that were created by Magic the Gathering players. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the specific ways that the cards are worded and how the wording that the people who designed those cards chose works or does not work within the existing framework of the Magic the Gathering rules. Now, I know that this is a super exciting topic for me, but I feel like templating is one of those things that doesn't quite get as much respect. For Magic the Gathering specifically, among all the other trading card games that I'm familiar with, the Magic the Gathering team that works on templating makes a heroic effort to make sure all of the cards are worded in such a way that it's unambiguous and clear what the cards do. And I think, for one, that this team deserves a lot more credit than they get. Certainly, I think that they get a lot less recognition than some of the sexier aspects of the people who create Magic, like, for example, the card designers, or the people who do the stories, or the people who make the art for the cards, or even the rules team. And so I think that this is a great way to give everybody who works on Magic templating a little bit more recognition too. Okay, so first of all, what is templating? And for the purposes of this presentation, when I say the word templating, what I'm referring to is the specific words that are used on a Magic card in order to convey exactly what that card does. And cards that are templated well tend to be easy to understand and clear and intuitive in their interactions with other cards. On the other hand, cards that are templated poorly tend to have the opposite of those properties. And so this is the sort of thing that we're going to be talking about, is how the exact wording on the cards goes to all of those different things that I just discussed. And certainly Magic is a game where if the card is worded just a little bit differently, then that can make a huge impact on how the rules and policy interact with that card, as I've definitely noted in several of my previous videos. Finally, before I go on, I want to make sure that I note that I am in no way making a dig at any of the people who designed the cards that I'm pulling up today. Certainly, Magic the Gathering templating is a terrifyingly complicated endeavor, and it's even the case that some of the professionals make some mistakes every now and again. With that being said, it's certainly not the case that I would expect anybody who was just making up a Magic card for fun to go through all of the laborious details that you would have to if you were going to actually print a card for real. And so let's take a look at some of the cards that I pulled out that I thought had some interesting card designs, and take a look at how they work or don't work within the framework of Magic comprehensive rules. So this is the first card that I picked, which is called Value for Life, and you can see that it says creatures are treasures. Now, this is one of the big time pitfalls I think that a lot of people who are new to templating go into, which is that it's really intuitively obvious what you think this card should do. However, it turns out that this card, as written, does not function within the Magic the Gathering rules. Well, at least it probably does not function in the way that the designer probably intended. First of all, let's notice that treasure is actually an artifact type. And what that means is that something that is a creature but not an artifact would not be able to become a treasure. This is because if you do not have the correct card type, then you are not able to gain any subtypes that are associated with that card type. So what this card would actually do if it were actually in a game of Magic is it would make all of the artifact creatures into treasures, but it would not affect any of the creatures that were not artifact creatures. And I'm pretty sure that does not align with the vision for this card. Another thing that I'm pretty sure probably does not align with the vision of this card is the fact that treasure is just a subtype of artifact. And even though treasures, in the definition provided by treasure tokens, have a specific ability, the treasure subtype does not by itself confer that ability the way that the basic land types, for example, confer the ability to tap for white, black, blue, red, or green as appropriate. So to put that in a little bit more concrete terms, if you didn't follow what I was just saying, basically, even though all treasure tokens have the ability to sacrifice themselves to add mana to your mana pool, if you just give the treasure subtype to an artifact, then that's not by itself going to give the ability to sacrifice to add mana to your mana pool. Rather, you would need to specifically spell out on Value for Life that you would, in addition to gaining the treasure subtype, you would also gain that ability. It's kind of unusual, now that I think of it, that treasures and all of the other predefined tokens don't have the exact same thing that the basic land types have, but I suppose that makes sense because they make new different types of tokens all the time, and it would be pretty ridiculous if they had to make a rule for every single one of those types that would say that any token that exists that had this subtype would also have these set of abilities. And I think that that probably is the correct way to go from a rule standpoint, making it so they do not by default have those abilities, just because it opens up a little bit more design space. We've had treasure creatures in Magic's past, and those creatures may or may not have the thematic treasure ability, but it also gives you a lot more freedom if you were going to make a copy of something that came into play as a token, and that way your copy wouldn't have the predefined values stapled onto it. Okay, so with that, I would probably have to change the wording of this one a little bit so that it would say creatures are artifact treasures in addition to their other types, and it would also probably need to say that they gain the ability to tap and sacrifice to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. The designer may or may not have intended this to work with Summoning Sickness the way that normal treasures do, that is, you would be able to sacrifice it the turn that it came into play. I'm not really sure what the correct answer for that would be, but you could also add a line in there that would say you would be able to activate that ability on the first turn if that was something that was desired. This is one of those things where you would probably have to ask the original card designer for some input if you wanted to change that in a way that would work in line with their vision, because I could really see that one going either way. Alright, so the next card that I'm going to be talking about is this one here, the Dreadmaw's family. And before I go too deep into this, I want to point out that I'm only talking about templating here. So templating would be referring to the specific choice of words that are used on the card. I'm not going to be talking too much about the fact that, for example, card subtypes tend to be capitalized, or the fact that maybe you've got an apostrophe that's going the wrong way, or stuff like that. Things like that are really more the domain of proofreaders or editors, which are definitely also an important part of the Magic team, but it's something that I'm, well, a lot less qualified to talk about. So with this one being the case, we can see that if it was kicked, then when it comes into play, we're going to create 3/3/3 green dinosaur tokens named Large Dreadmaw, Sizable Dreadmaw, and Substantial Dreadmaw. And so with that being the case, it's kind of unclear. Is this going to create 3 of each of those tokens, or is it just going to create 1 token of each of the 3 names? And I think that it's probably pretty obvious to most people what the intent is. However, it really doesn't seem like it's unambiguous from the sense of somebody who was asking that question. What would you tell someone who was asking you that in a way that you would be confident that they would be able to be satisfied with the answer? It's really not clear whether we should be making 3 of each of them or 1 of each of them. Unfortunately, for this specific card, there isn't really an elegant way to condense that down the way that it is here. So if you were going to create a card that matched with the intent of this one, you would probably have to spell out something like, if it was kicked, then create a 3/3 green dinosaur token named Large Dreadmaw, a 3/3 green dinosaur token named Sizable Dreadmaw, and a 3/3 green dinosaur token named Substantial Dreadmaw. And, well, if you do that, then the card loses a lot of its charm. I'm not sure if there's a better way that you could unambiguously make it so that you would only be getting 1 of those, 1 of each of those types of tokens, but I think that's probably something you would need to do if you ever wanted to have a card like this see print. Okay, so now let's take a little bit of a talk about this one here, Slip into Reverie. And this one has a kind of a similar issue when you go through the effect. So you say counter target spell unless its controller mills 8 cards. And there's nothing wrong with that. That works perfectly well. However, the real issue would be if you cleaved it. And that in that case, it would say counter target spell, comma, its controller mills 8 cards. And the issue with that is that that sentence is not grammatical. Your actual punctuation mark that you would need in there would probably be a semicolon if you wanted that sentence to be a valid English sentence based on the rules of English grammar. And I know that we were talking about before not being a proofreading thing, but this is something that's really important. Wizards of the Coast, as far as I'm aware, has never printed a card that does not strictly adhere to all of the rules of standard English grammar. And so with that being the case, it would be extremely important that the cleave wording was also a valid English sentence and not a run-on sentence. If you take a look at all of the other cleave cards that have been printed, you can see what kind of great lengths that Wizards have gone to in order to completely make sure that both the cleave wording and the normal wording both make sense and are both valid English sentences. And so with that being the case, this mechanic was something that I was very interested to hear from our foreign community, how it worked in their languages, because I feel like it would be very difficult to translate these cleave cards in such a way that the sentences worked out as well as they did. So if anybody has any insights on that, I'd be very interested to hear about that in the comments. But again, we have the same sort of problem with Slip into Reverie that we had with the Dreadmaw on the previous slide. And that's that it's not really possible, as far as I'm aware, or as far as I could do by playing around with it for a while, to come up with a good, elegant way to express this thought that is really so neatly expressed in the original card. It's very obvious that the thing that you would do is counter the spell unless the player who controls that spell chooses to mill 8 cards. But if you cleave it, then you would have the player do both of them. In other words, counter the spell and also mill the 8 cards. And I could not think of a wording that adequately expressed that without being, well, basically like a choose one, or a kicker kind of a thing, where it basically reworded the entire spell, or it used the entire wording of the first mode in the second mode. And so if anybody has any ideas about how to reword this card in such a way that does not include a run-on sentence, I would be very, very excited to see that too, because I think this is a really cool design. And so let's take a look. There's another one that I talked about, that this is another thing that tends to come up when people make their own cards. So we've got Caring Mother and Defender of the Powerless. Now, Caring Mother, there's absolutely no problem that I have with this one here. If a creature with less than 1 power dies, then you would transform Caring Mother, and when it enters the battlefield, you would create a 1 human creature token. So that part's pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot of crazy stuff going on there. The specific issue that I have with this one is on the Defender of the Powerless side. So if you take a look, the power equal to the number of creatures you control with less than 1 power, well, that is kind of an interesting question, because you've got kind of like a Russell's paradox sort of a thing. So it is possible that the Defender of the Powerless could itself have less than 1 power, in which case that would affect the number of creatures that you control with less than 1 power. So if you only controlled the Defender of the Powerless, well, then would it have 1 power or would it have 0 power? If it has 0 power, then that would mean that it would also have 1 power, because it would itself be a creature with power less than 1. But if it did have 1 power, so it doesn't really make sense from that point of view, because it's ambiguous whether it counts itself. So you would have to probably put in some sort of a phrase where it explicitly excluded itself from that number, or else maybe you could put in so that it would always have at least 1 power. So you could have like a 1+ star, the way that Tarmogoyf's toughness had. So that kind of gets us out of that predicament. You would probably need to do both of those, because if you had some sort of a global all creatures get -1/-1 type of an effect, then you could run into that same sort of issue again. But the other really interesting thing that we would need to work on would be the second ability that Defender of the Powerless has. And so if you notice here, it says if a creature you control with less than 1 power would be exiled or destroyed. It isn't. Instead, deal 1 damage to Defender of the Powerless. So that is an interesting way to put that ability. And the reason I say that is because, well, it would work okay if we were going to use like a removal spell against a 0 power creature, right? So if we were going to Doomblade a 0 power creature, well, what that would do is it would destroy that creature. And so we would apply that replacement effect there. Instead, the 0 power creature would not be destroyed. And instead, we would deal 1 damage to Defender of the Powerless. So, that's all well and good, and that's working the way that things are probably intended to work. However, we're going to come up to a little bit of an issue if we have a creature that's got lethal damage on it. And so recall that the state-based action that puts lethally damaged creatures into their owner's graveyard does so by actually destroying those creatures. And so you can see the problem here, which is that the ability on Defender of the Powerless does not say that you remove all the damage from that creature. And so what that means is that the creature with 0 power would still have lethal damage on it after this replacement effect applies. And so the state-based action that wants to put it into its owner's graveyard would try to happen again, and at that point the Defender of the Powerless would take another 1 damage, and then the state-based action would try to apply again, and it would deal another 1 damage to the Defender of the Powerless, at which point the Defender of the Powerless would itself have lethal damage on it. And so that would mean that the creature would no longer have the Defender of the Powerless in play to protect it anymore, because of course the third point of damage on the Defender of the Powerless would in fact spell the end of it. And after that happens, the creature would still die because it would still have lethal damage on it. So that's probably not a functionality that's really intended. And again, you would probably need to say something like, if another creature you control has that has less than one power would be exiled or destroyed, because in the case that you did not have that, then you might end up with a situation where the Defender of the Powerless itself got lethally damaged, but every time the game tried to destroy it for having lethal damage on it, then the game would not be able to do that due to the fact that its replacement effect also applies to itself. So this is a really cool idea for a card, but we would need to clean up both of those issues before we wanted to print something like this. And so let's see, take a look at this next one here. Now, Goblin P.I, this is a really interesting idea for a card. Like, just like all the other ones, I think that this is another really cool idea for a design. Like, if you would search your library for a card, you draw 2 cards instead. And again, this is one of those situations where I feel like a lot of the time, you can come up with a great idea like this, but there's some different stuff going on under Magic's hood that makes it not seem like as great of an idea once someone points that stuff out. So let's take a look at some of the issues that we might see if Goblin P.I was a real Magic card that they printed. Right? So the first thing that I can think of is if you were going to do something like a Flooded Strand. So if you notice, with Flooded Strand, it says that we're going to search your library for a Plains or Island card. Now, that is different from searching your library for a card. We're not searching our library for a card, we're searching our library for a Plains or Island card. And depending on how your interpretation of that is, it might be the case that does not actually qualify as searching your library for a card. So it's kind of not really well defined whether Flooded Strand would actually cause the Goblin P.I to have you draw 2 cards instead. Or not. So that's one thing that's kind of not great, and we would have to either change the comprehensive rules so it specifically spells that out, or else maybe we would have to do. Right now, I believe it probably would not work with Flooded Strand, and the Flooded Strand search, because we're not searching for a card, we're searching for a Plains or Island card. I think that is probably different enough that the replacement effect of Goblin P.I would not interact with that happening. The other thing that kind of goes along with that would be something like the intuition here, because again, searching your library for 3 cards is not the same thing as searching your library for a card. It's pretty similar, but it actually is not the same. In fact, when we have stuff that lets you draw multiple cards, there actually is a rule in the CR that says that if you are instructed to draw 3 cards, then what that actually gets processed by the game as is drawing a card and then drawing a card again and then drawing a third card. So instead of drawing all the 3 cards at once, you actually draw them one at a time. And the reason that rule exists is because there's lots of replacement effects that say if you would draw a card. And again, drawing a card is not the same thing as drawing 3 cards. And so with that being the case, if we wanted the Goblin P.I. to interact with the intuition searching for 3 cards, we would probably need to make a similar rule in the comprehensive rules that would do something similar with searching. And it's not really, well, there hasn't been a reason to make such a rule yet. So I wouldn't expect it to be very likely to see such a change happening. And then there's one other kind of like interesting thing about that, which is like, you know, what with the intuition, it says that the target opponent would choose one of the cards that we search for. You know, we have to reveal those 3 cards, and then target opponent would have to choose one. And then we would put that card into our hand and the rest into our graveyard, and then shuffle your library. So the way the Goblin P.I. It replaces just the part where you search your library for 3 cards. It would not replace any of that other stuff. So you would still like try to reveal the 3 cards that you searched for, but of course there are no cards that you search for, so you probably wouldn't be doing that. And then the same thing with the like opponent choosing one and putting it in your hand and the rest in your graveyard. But you still would shuffle your library. You know, that part isn't getting replaced. So even though there's like no reason to shuffle your library anymore, you still would be getting instructed to do that. So that's not like a great feature for this card, because let's say you scried some cards to the bottom, right? So like in that case, the shuffling your library would be relevant, because those cards that you scried to the bottom wouldn't be relevant anymore. But I guarantee you that if this was like an actual card that people played, most of the time people would shortcut straight through and they would not shuffle their library. So then we would get these kind of like weird judge calls where it's like, oh, judge, I was supposed to shuffle my library with this search card, except I didn't, because, you know, I drew cards with the Goblin P.I. instead. So that's kind of another, like, you know, it's not a deal breaker, but it's also a thing that you would need to be aware of. If you were to template this card, Goblin P.I., a little bit differently so that it would also you know, interact with the shuffling, then maybe that situation would be a little bit better. Another kind of an interesting card that you would want to think about would be this one, Doomsday. So even if we got those first few issues that we talked about resolved, then we still have this kind of weird one, which is like where we're searching our library and graveyard for 5 cards. So, you know, what do we think about this? Like, would we get to like search our graveyard for 4 cards and then draw 2 cards? Is that how that would work? Would it only be the case that, you know, would we be able to search for all 5 cards out of our graveyard, and then not draw any cards? Would we get to choose how many we're searching for out of our graveyard and how many we're searching for out of our library? It's not really clear. And then of course, again, the rest of the stuff that Doomsday does is not getting replaced. So you still would be exiling everything else. And again, like if we're searching for the cards one at a time, then, you know, are we going to search for the 5 cards first and then exile the rest? Or are we going to search for 1 card and then exile the rest, and then search for the second one and exile the rest? So the rule that we wrote that covered, you know, how multiple searches are going to be handled one at a time would need to be robust enough to give a definitive answer to questions like that. And then, of course, you know, you put the chosen cards, of which there probably would not be any if they got replaced by the Goblin P.I. On top of your library, and then you would lose half your life rounded up. So that part still works just fine. So as you can see, there's, you know, it's a relatively simple effect. Like it's really easy to describe to somebody what this card does, but it's very difficult to describe what this effect does in technically sufficient detail to explain what all the answers to these questions should be. And in fact, for me anyway, like a lot of those questions that I just raised now, they don't really have an intuitive answer. And if I were to talk to the person who designed this card, it's not really clear to me what answer that this person would give me if I were to ask those questions and say, well, what do you think that it should work like? Because, you know, if you're like the templating team or the rules team, then that's basically the problem that you have is like, you know, if you don't know how the card is supposed to work, then you got to talk to whoever the designer is and say, okay, well, what should I have it do if it's like this, or what should I have it do if it's like that? And that's the reason why a lot of mechanics have like these really weird stuff in the CR where it describes how they work. The weird wording and the non-intuitive wording that probably differs from the flavor text that intuitively describes how the card works is almost certainly a result of the fact that you have to phrase things a very certain way to get around problems like the ones that I pointed out here. So, okay, and then finally to close things out, I wanted to talk about this card here, Goose Chase. And I think, well, first of all, besides being like a really fun and interesting idea for a card, it's the sort of thing that we haven't really seen, sending a creature on an adventure. So, with this card here, actually, I think that the card as written actually would work completely the way that it's intended to. I think that the templating here is really on point. The send target creature on an adventure is certainly something that most people would intuitively have a pretty firm idea of what the answer would be if the question came up of, well, what does this actually do? And I think most people would be able to, especially if they were familiar already with the adventure mechanic. So the only real thing that I would need to do in order to give this card a pass to see print and normal black border paper magic would be that we would need to do something. We would need to do one thing, and that one thing would be like making a rule in the comprehensive rules that defines what it means to send a creature on an adventure. So you cannot just have reminder text that says what you're intending to have happen and call that a day. You need to actually have specifically written somewhere in the comprehensive rules what that phrase that you're using, which of course we've never seen on a Magic card before. You would need to have spelled out in the comprehensive rules somewhere what that phrase means. So this would be like my kind of attempt to do that. So you would send a permanent on an adventure. To do so, you exile that permanent. For as long as it remains exiled, its owner may play it from exile. So first of all, this is kind of a different thing. I would probably want to say in the reminder text that it would say its owner rather than its controller may cast it from exile. The reason for that would of course be like if I stole someone else's creature and then we goose chased it in exile, it turns out there is not a controller that's defined for a card. It has an owner, but it doesn't really have a controller defined for it unless it's on the stack or on the battlefield. So that's an easy enough problem to fix. And again, that's in the reminder text. So it's not even really a problem with the actual text that's on this card here. But the other kind of interesting thing is for as long as it's remains exiled, its owner may play it from exile. I said play it rather than cast it because I had a feeling that if someone was to goose chase my Dryad Arbor, it feels like I should probably be able to get the Dryad Arbor back if I just play it as my land for the turn. So with the wording that I selected there for this rule in the comprehensive rules, then it is able to do that just perfectly well. Now there is one other thing that I maybe should probably add, which is that if the card is already an adventure, then I should probably say something about how you would not be able to cast it as the instant or sorcery half. You would only be able to cast it as the creature half. And I feel like that's probably in line with what the designer of this card probably intended. But again, without talking to that person, then I don't really have a good way to say for sure on that. But this is another thing that you would probably have to think about is if you were to goose chase and a card that already had adventure, you would need to make sure that the rules around that handled that situation properly as well. So the way that I've worded it, it's actually possible to play it in any way that you would normally be able to legally cast that card. So that's another kind of thing that you might want to think about here. And so with that, there's only one thing left to say, which is thank you so much to all of my patrons. This was a really interesting topic, and if everybody likes it, then maybe we'll do some more of these from time to time where I review the templating of cards. Like I said, I really like templating, and I really think that the templating team from Wizards of the Coast does not get enough credit for the hard work that they do, probably as a result of the fact that it's not as sexy as some of the other stuff that has to happen to make Magic happen. But with that being the case, thank you so much to all of my patrons for your support of my videos. And also thank you to all of the people who made these cards and posted them online so that, wacky guys like me could put them up on take a look at them and appreciate them. I think these are some awesome Magic the Gathering card designs. And if you're interested in seeing the original source threads that I got any of these from, I have a link in the description below. But that is all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.